Okie dokie. Psalm 14 in the New American Standard begins by saying there in verse 1, to the choir master, at least in the ESV, to the choir master of David. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They do abominable deeds. There is none who does good. The Lord looks down from heaven on the children of man to see if there are any who understand, who seek after God. They have all turned aside. Together they've become corrupt. There is none who does good, not even one. Have they no knowledge? All the evildoers who eat up my people as they eat bread and do not call upon the Lord? There they are in great terror, for God is with the generation of the righteous. You would shame the plans of the poor, but the Lord is his refuge. Oh, that salvation for Israel would come out of Zion. When the Lord restores the fortunes of his people, let Jacob rejoice, let Israel be glad. What strikes you, or what, I guess I noted earlier that this is a difficult psalm to categorize. If you don't want to just repeat that out loud, maybe help us with why. What is this missing? What is it trying to say? What are the big themes that you see? What's the important stuff it seems like you see when you read it? I saw your hand go first.
First thing I thought of is that sometimes we can forget atheism and unbelief aren't new. Atheism wasn't invented in the late 20th century.
Yeah.
There have always been people who deny God. There have always been people who live abominably, as it says.
Yeah. So the belief that there's no God, or certainly that God that we believe in isn't real, isn't new, right? It's come by a lot of different names. The most recent persuasion is that there is no God altogether, right? Kind of pure atheism. The folks reading this who says there is no God could very well believe in other gods. I would say they're not inclined to do that, but it could be, well, this God isn't the real one, right? So always think about it. It could come from their, well, it came from their angle first, and they might have naturally read it as, well, Yahweh, Israel's God, is not real. Some other God is real. So there's always that. Yes?
I would call it a lament. Probably. It's as close as it gets. But I thought what was interesting is I kind of wondered when I read this, does it seem like this disbelief has been fostered by the fact that God is not taking the action on the wicked that we've studied the past several weeks? And that this is sort of a perception of the culmination of, hey God, you're not beating up on them quick enough, and you're not punishing them, so thus they're not going to believe in your power.
Yeah. I don't get the feeling that this is coming from someone who believes in God. I get the feeling that this is descriptive of kind of that other group of people, right? And the reason why I say that is that the type of person that would be frustrated that God hasn't acted yet would be a believer, right? So this doesn't sound like that person. This sounds like the person who is outside God's people. And also you've got, verse 4, you have the contrast between they being in great terror and then God's with the generation of the righteous, right? You would shame the plans of the poor, but the Lord's his refuge. So there's that, the they that's being talked about are the people not believing in him versus kind of the ones who do. Now, that being said, it's a very strong temptation to say that, well, God hasn't acted against the wicked, therefore he doesn't exist. That could be a motivating belief.
Would they call themselves fools in verse 1?
I wouldn't think they would, right? It's almost like this other person or this other group of people, type of person.
Observers of this evil, is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah. That's the way it feels, at least to start with. All right, other stuff. What's important about the psalm? Now, one comment you made, you said you thought it was a lament, and I'm interested as to why.
Well, if we're observing, the fools don't think it's God, the people are evil, they don't believe, so on and so forth. Wouldn't you be lamenting the fact that all this evil is surrounding you?
So
I would be if I were in the middle of it.
So it's the feeling that this is a complaint about these
World.
folks. Okay, I can
Similar to
subscribe to
13.
that. What's that?
Which is similar to 13. Of 4, 6, and 7, the verses I would say that make it feel like a woman.
Mm-hmm.
Because, and to me, 4 is like the middle of it, the heart of what the problem is here, or the issue. The idea that they eat up my people as they eat bread. And if you notice, they eat my people.
Yeah.
So that's an identity, you know, that this is an Israelite talking about Israel being taken away. And
Mhm.
it's interesting, the ones he's writing about may well have included those of Israel too. But the wicked ones in Israel who eat up the righteous in Israel.
Who seems to be speaking in verse 4? Speaking of that expression, my people. I don't think any Israelite would dare call these his own people. It seems it's written from God's perspective, right? Have they no, in the ESV, have they no knowledge, all the evildoers who eat up my people as they eat bread and do not call upon the Lord? It's not odd for God to call himself Yahweh. He does it before. I mean, he's done it before. It's almost a complaint from on high. One person I read put it this way. What is man saying versus what is God saying? What is man saying in verse 1? Or the evil, wicked, foolish man. It's man saying there's no God. What's God saying when he looks at the situation?
You're a fool to say that.
Well, for one, you're foolish, and for two, God kind of looking at it from the other direction says, there's no good down there. There's none who does good. Right? He even says it twice. All have turned aside. Together they've become corrupt. There is none who does good, not even one. Right? He's looking from heaven in verse 2 to see if there's anybody down there who can see what, who has some sense, we might say.
And that count is like Sodom and Gomorrah. I'm counting how many am I seeing?
That scene has been portrayed before, right? It's a common Old Testament idea.
Thought of Elijah. I'm the only one left. There's no
Elijah's perspective on Israel, or on yeah.
We can fall into that same trap of it is so bad.
Mm-hmm.
There's nobody who cares.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a grim look at the world. It's a realistic look at the world when you look at it from God's perspective. Yep.
Do you not think that David could have called Israel my people?
Yes, I suppose so.
I mean, it's one of his songs, right?
Right.
So it does seem possible that even he could say that even
Okay.
They consume my people. And as a king, I would.
That's a good point. I forgot about that.
To those people. And yes, they're God's people, but.
But it could have come from David's perspective and been exactly the same. You're exactly right. That's a good point. All right.
Verse 6 is an interesting verse too, because you shame the counsel of the poor. That's an interesting phrase, an interesting thing to bring up, I guess. We don't normally think about the poor having counsel.
Mm-hmm.
But yet,
Or this one says plans, but I think the same idea. You would shame what they were going to do, right? You would inhibit them. What are the poor trying to do? Improve their circumstance. You, the wicked fool, would run roughshod over their need, their vulnerability, and do whatever you're going to do to them, which will probably take advantage of them, right? But God is the refuge. He's the one who prevents all of those things. Two things are kind of interesting in parallel. In verse 5, God describes his people as the generation of the righteous, but in verse 6, they would shame the plans of the poor. What's the difference? Often there is no difference. It's more often than not, it's the righteous who are the vulnerable, right? The poor, as described here. Too often, those two groups are one and the same. It's just interesting that you kind of see both perspectives of that there. All right, real quick, just some other things. So the more I think about lament, the more I'm leaning that way right now, currently, because it does seem that this is it's a complaint about, you know, what's going on with the world at large. Plus, there's at least an implied request in verse 7, right? Most laments, they start with a complaint, and then there's a kind of an ask for a request for the problem to be solved, right? A supplication, and then there's usually praise at the end. There is some of that here too. But the beginning of verse 7, oh, that salvation for Israel would come out of Zion. He's not calling for it directly. He's like, you know, oh, I wish it would be different, you know, which is itself kind of a request. So I lean that way too, at least right now. It is an odd psalm because there's not a confession of sin, as you would see in a lot of the laments, right? I have sinned, and then that's my problem. Or we have sinned in Israel's case. There's no direct praise of God, really.
That is consistent with the lament. The idea of that there is no praise, that all around is just devoted.
But a lot of the laments include, they work their way back to praise. We've seen that before.
I would say working their way back is verse 7. That's, oh, you know, oh, that God would, in effect, oh, that he would send the Messiah.
Yeah.
That would bring back the captivity of my people Israel.
I'm going to tie the Messiah to verse 7, hopefully a little later. Just nuts and bolts stuff. Number one, written of David, as was brought up, and secondly, we don't know why. That's becoming more and more common. Just to give you a sense of how difficult it is to sort of put this psalm in a group. I got this book back in college. This is when I took Old Testament poetry with Tommy Peeler. I very nearly failed that class, okay? I was like, I had a D- and I had to go study. It was on the bare edge. This was the book I should have read in college, but didn't. But I still have it, and I've read it now, and it's actually very good.
You want us to grade you now?
No, I would do much better now than then, to be sure. It's a good book about the book of Psalms, but it doesn't go individually into every single psalm. It's just a book about the book of Psalms. It's actually pretty good. And it gives the big categories of lament and praise and wisdom and royal psalms and such and so on. In the back of it is a scriptural index where it lists all of the Bible passages it uses and on what page. There is exactly one page about Psalm 14 in the entire book. And it's because the beginning of Psalm 14 says, to the choir master. And it's a reference to that. That's it, right? So if nothing else, maybe it's a sign of most people really don't know where to put it. It doesn't fit neatly into some of the other groups. It does have a pretty clear structure, though, I think. When you take the first 3 verses, it's about the fool, or we'll learn more about that in a moment. And what happens when he says there's no God? What is the product of that? What does he become, or she, whomever this is, right? What type of person does this turn out to be? What does this mean for a group of people or a world that would do this? And then 4 through 6 really kind of turn away from the fool himself or herself and towards other people. Right? 4 describes mistreatment of my people. 5 is the contrast between they and the generation of the righteous. 6 is the plans of the poor versus what they would do to them, right? 4 through 6 is really focused on other people. God's people versus, them. And then 7 is kind of its own thing. And I think that might be one way to sort of break it up, is 1 through 3 is more about the fool who believes there's no God. And then 4 through 6 is kind of how that works out among people, right? God's people versus the others. And then 7 kind of stands on its own. In terms of observations or word type stuff, there's the Hebrew word in. It roughly means there is no or there is not or just the word not. It happens 4 times in the first 3 verses. When it says, the fool says in his heart, there is no God, it's that word. In verse 1 again, there is none, it's the same word. Verse 3, there is none who does good, not even one. Both of those are this one word, and it just means not the thing, whatever that is. The fool says in his heart, the word fool is Nabal. It's Nabal. It's exactly the same word. Now, you remember how Nabal behaved? You might remember the story, 1 Samuel, was it 25? David and his men are out in the wilderness. Nabal treats them very rashly, very foolishly, very stupidly. And this is the name that Abigail, the loving wife, said, truly he is called Nabal, or literally, truly he is called the fool, because that's what he did. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. That is an unbelievably stupid thing to do and say, and believe and practice. And the word Nabal fits the story. On the idea that there's no God, we've heard something similar to that before. Back in 10 and verse 4, right? In the description of the wicked that begins 10 and verse 3 down through verse 11, 10 and verse 4 says, in the pride of his face, the wicked does not seek him. All his thoughts are, there is no God. Right? So, obviously, the person in 1 through 3 in Psalm 14 is wicked, but you see the connection between the wicked say there's no God and the fool says there's no God. They're one and the same, right? Beliefs, like elections, have consequences, right? What you believe changes who you are and what you do and the type of person you turn out to be. In verse 3, the idea they've all turned aside. It's a very common phrase. It just means to leave the path. If you imagine, you know, we say the straight and narrow, right? The yellow brick road, whatever you want to say. To remain on that is to be doing the right thing, to be on the right course, to be headed where you want to go. Well, leaving the path would be not that, right? Doing badly, doing poorly. It happens a lot. In Exodus 32, when the people of Israel sin with the golden calf, that's the exact phrase that God uses for their behavior. They have turned aside. It didn't mean Israel had taken a left turn. It means they have abandoned what they should be doing. Right? It's an expression that kind of points that direction. The word understand is an interesting one too. The Lord looks down from heaven on the children of man to see if there are any who understand. It's the same word, Genesis 42, in verse 23. When Joseph's brothers are standing in front of Joseph, and they're conversing with one another in their native tongue, probably Hebrew, and they didn't know that Joseph could understand them. Same word, right? It's that idea of being able to intelligibly see, regard what the thing is. It's the same word in Psalm 2 we saw a few weeks ago. Psalm 2 in verse 10 says, now therefore, O kings, be wise. That's the word for understand. It's literally, if you're going to be wise, if you're going to be a king, you need to understand. You need to see what's going on. The Lord looks down from heaven to see if there's anybody who we might say has any sense down there. Anybody who still recognizes that he's still God. The word there for knowledge in verse 4, have they no knowledge? Same word as knowledge of good and evil. It's used in Genesis 3, right? The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Same idea there. This was, I might need to redo my notes because this was when I'm kind of looking at verse 4 from God's perspective. It's the fact that God has made comments about eating his own, or the wicked eating up his people, and really usually it's Israel eating up the people, which is bad. God has made those sorts of statements before. In Proverbs 30 and verse 20, the adulterous woman is described as one who eats and wipes her mouth and then says, I have done no violence. It's as if they do this as easily as they would eat bread. Right?
And Jesus made his condemnation of the Pharisees, about how that they would take a widow's house.
Devour widows' houses, right? There's that very literal.
It's that same idea. And they were, which makes the point that this could be writing about those even who are of Israel doing this to other Israelites.
Yeah.
Because that's what Jesus' complaint was. You're doing this to your own.
And to be fair, David could have easily have said that, right? That they're eating my people as easily as they eat bread, right? That very naturally could have come from him too. there is an important word difference. In verse 5, there they are in great terror. The word there for terror is not the same as the word for fear. In Hebrew, there are two different words. Kind of like in English, there are two different words, right? Fear and terror are kind of, one sort of a more intense version of the other, right? Same way in Hebrew. I don't remember what the original was, but the word for fear is the same one you see again in Psalm 2 and verse 10. Or Psalm 2 and verse 11, serve the Lord with fear is not the same as serve the Lord with terror, right? Terror carries with it maliciousness, right? Carries with it evil almost. Interesting. In Deuteronomy 28, one of the curses of the covenant, one of the curses that God says would happen to Israel if they forsook God, was that they would be in great terror of Him. They would not fear the Lord, they would be afraid of what He would do to them. Right? There's a difference in the Bible between fear of God and dread of God. And Psalm 14 says that the wicked are in great terror, they dread Him. Right? Which is, the Hebrew writer would put it like a fearful expectation of judgment. You know that line? I think it's Hebrews 10. Same idea there. Okay. Now, what would they have done with it? What would the listeners, what was intended to them, right? First and foremost. Usually their lessons are ours, so these are good ways to think about it. But what are the lessons to an Israelite, person hearing this sung or read aloud to them? What do they come away with? What's that?
Which one am I? Am I
Yeah.
the first 4 verses?
Yeah.
If word of it is that me?
Yep. We've had versions of that question before, right? Psalm 1, blessed is the righteous person versus the wicked person. And the choice is, again, which one am I? Psalm 14, am I the fool? Am I the one who doesn't believe in God? And if so, what's the evidence of that? That's it. Yeah.
I was gonna say, if part of the interpretation here is the wicked, or the one, because God does not act, does not mean that He does not exist. That's
So-
one point about this. At one point, Israel continuously made that mistake.
Yeah. Yeah, not trusting His timing, right, is a big flaw. What happens to a person if they say something? Now, it's funny, reading Psalm 14 and verse 1 in our time seems almost insulting to a big swath of the population, right? There's like the bumper sticker I saw. It's like National April Fool's Day, Psalm 14:1, right? The fool says there's no God, right? It seems almost insulting. But what happens to a person when they forsake God? What's the result of it, according to the psalm?
They're incorruptible, they do whatever feels good to them.
Yeah,
Basically, they have no conscience, they have no boundaries, they have nothing to restrain them.
yeah, they are corrupt. They're not. They're not still. They're ruined. They're defiled. They do not things that are just unsightly. They do what's abominable. Right in verse 1. It results in none of them having redeemable qualities over the course of time. None who does good. God looks from heaven. Where can God not see? Who can He not see? Those are answers to the same question. Nothing. No one. Right? He's looking, and all these people who say there's no God, there is nothing down there redeemable or, good in that. Give you an interesting connection. Someone mentioned earlier the city of Sodom, right? And looking and seeing, and there's obviously very, very few people there. Give me a story before that one where God looked down and He saw nothing but black.
Nope.
It's the flood narrative, right? It's Noah. There's an interesting word connection too. In Genesis 6 and verse 5, he saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and every intention of the thought of his heart was only evil continually. And he regretted that he made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. The word for what God said He would do to them is the same word as corrupt here in our text. The word for what God said He would do to the earth and to those on it, because they've turned from Him, is the same word as Psalm 14 where it says they've become corrupt. So literally the idea is this. When you turn from God, you become corrupt. And that's the same thing God does to you. He corrupts you. He destroys you. He turns you into nothing, right? Those two ideas are tied together. Yep.
This also will, this puts to death the idea of moralistic
Put to
atheism.
death. I like it. Sorry, go ahead.
The idea of moralistic atheism.
You're right.
If you've ever read any atheistic writings, they are very big of trying to tie knots in their tongue to say that they can somehow have a moral system.
Yep. We can still do all the good things, we just don't need the God telling us to do the good things.
Yeah.
One of the best answers I ever heard to that, someone said, yeah, but your children won't. And their children won't. Why? They have no reason to, right? They have nothing to warrant making the same choice as their parents because there's no standard for right and wrong. We go on for hours about that. Also, Exodus 32, when God looked down and he saw the people of Israel cavorting around the foot of Mount Sinai, it's the same word for what he said he would do to them in that context. They had abandoned him, and he used that same word for corrupt. I will do that to them because they've forsaken me. It seems like, it doesn't seem like it, it is. The beginning of understanding of knowledge, of having the facts that are correct in the world, it starts with the knowledge of God, right? There's a proverb to that effect, right? The fear of the Lord, how does it go? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. It is the root of understanding. It is the key idea that renders a person either with understanding or without it. Our world would not say that, but that's the way it is, right? Fools reject wisdom and instruction, it goes on. This is the core idea, that there is a God and that he's in charge. And everything else flows from that he's the creator. The idea that God looks down from heaven in search of spiritual life is again the flood story, right? God looked to see and there was nothing except what? Genesis 6 says Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. So there was you might imagine, there was a speck, a pinprick of light down there, right? Noah wasn't a flawless human being. There's only been one of those. But there was something about him that stood out in the darkness, and he noticed it, right? On the idea of God looking down from heaven, if you're in 14, back up to Psalm 11. We had that already. Psalm 11 in verse 4 carries with it not just the idea that he looks, but that he looks with judgment. He looks with discernment to see who's on the up and who's not. Psalm 11 verse 4, the Lord's in his holy temple, the Lord's throne is in heaven. His eyes see, so there's the seeing, his eyelids test the children of man. So not just casual gazing, but intently studying the earth and the people who are on it to see, who down there has any sense. It reminded me when I was going through this with the little kids class, we sing a song to this effect, right? Oh, be careful, little eyes, what you see, right? How does it end? For the Father up above is looking down in love. He's not looking down with, he's looking down because he cares about you, but he's still looking nonetheless. Right? And you can see that in the psalm, that God's still looking down from heaven. Remember I mentioned the two divisions of the psalm. It seems like 1 through 3 is about the person who rejects God, and 4 through 6 is kind of how it works out in regards to people. These are the two big mistakes people make, or the two things that happen when you reject God. For one, the reason why you reject God in the first place is because you don't like his law. You don't like him being in charge. And so all the things that God said to do, those are out. That happens quicker than you might think. Right? I don't want to obey God, so we're getting rid of God. But the second thing that happens is you begin mistreating people. It's no coincidence that the systems of government and the countries that employed them, that have murdered the most people in human history, were what sorts of governments? Communist and socialist governments. They all have one thing in common. They all reject belief in God. Without exception, all of them do. Okay. Doesn't it seem interesting that Psalm 14 starts with the rejection of belief in God And then by the time you get to verse 4, they're eating up people the way they would eat bread. And then they're shaming the plans of the poor. And they're in great terror, and God's with the just. When one rejects God, the next thing that will happen after ignoring God's law is they're going to hurt people. They're going to oppress and afflict. Right? And by God's people, I don't mean necessarily the church or Israel. I mean God's people as in He made them all in His image, and they will be mistreated. Right? There's no coincidence. Cultures that throw out God also throw out the way you should treat people. Right? Saw a picture today of it was from the city of Kharkiv in the 1930s. Kharkiv's in the Ukraine. Of course, it was under the Soviet Union. And it was a picture of just a normal sidewalk and the curb there. And there was a guy lying there on his back, just kind of, messed up. And the people were all just kind of on their way, right, walking by. The caption of the picture says the guy in the middle had starved to death. And he's just dead. And then you got the other Soviets just kind of milling around. I mean, nobody's. It's just like this is what happens, right? When God's rejected, when God's pulled out of a culture, out of a people, you get atrocity, right? It happens individually, and it happens on a nationwide basis. God's still on the side of His people and the vulnerable, and those two are usually the same. God recognizes His people are in a world that's wicked, right? And they're obviously in the minority. He's still on their side. He hasn't abandoned them in the darkness, right? He's still about defending them. Those people, like I said, are usually together. It's the same thing that's asked for in Psalm 10. Psalm 10, it says there, and this is what the wicked do to people again. It says, the helpless are crushed and sink down and fall by his might, by the wicked person's might. He says in his heart, God has forgotten. He's hidden his face. He will never see it. And then the request in verse 12. Arise, O God, or O Lord, O God, lift up your hand. Forget not the afflicted. Why does the wicked renounce God and say in his heart, you do not call to account? But you do see, you note mischief and vexation that you may take it into your hands. To you, the helpless commits himself. Many of the same ideas. The idea that God looks at the wicked, say, he doesn't see anything, and then God still is defending his vulnerable people. It's repeated again here in 14. If you're looking for someone to make your situation better, there's only one place to go for it, and that's God. Right? It's frustrating that the world would turn to itself for solutions when that's precisely what got them into the mess they're in. They turned to themselves, and they rejected the one who made them. They think, well, if we just try a little harder, it'll get a little better. Right? It doesn't work. You can push the pull door all you like. It's not opening until you read the instructions. And it's the same with people and God. You try all you like without God, it's not going to work. Okay, application stuff. Obviously, you throw out God, good goes with it. Simply put, if you get rid of the one who is good, all that is good goes with it. Right? It's not just the baby with the bathwater. It's throwing out with the world with the one who made it. Right? The one who made all the inhabitants of that world in his own image. If you remove that, there is nothing left, and what is left will die shortly. This is the picture of the world that Paul uses in Romans 1. If you have your Bible, we're going to be in Romans 3 in just a second. So if you turn over to Romans 1, notice how Paul begins the argument. He begins the argument for the gospel by showing that all people are evil and wicked and sinful. He begins in verse 18 of Romans 1. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. God and right go together. That's why ungod and unright also go together. What can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made, so they without excuse. Paul's making the argument, even without divine revelation, it's still obvious that there's a God based on you and the things that are around you. But what happened? Although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools. Not a coincidence. 14:1, the fool says in his heart, there's no God. And Paul, when he gets ready to describe the wicked, arrives on the Greek version of the same word, right? The fool. They exchanged their glory for the glory of created things, and they descend into all of the rest of the stuff that Romans 1 has. This is what happens when you abandon God. Romans 14 is quoted in the New Testament. It's quoted in Psalm 14 is quoted in Romans 3, beginning there in verse 10. Like I said, Paul begins the argument for the gospel by establishing when you leave God, you become wicked. Everybody has this wickedness problem, Jew and Gentile alike. But notice what he pulls to show that point. Romans 3 in verse 9, really, the second half of verse 9 says, we've already charged that all, both Jews and Gentiles, are under sin. As it's written, none is righteous, no, not one. No one understands, no one seeks for God. All have turned aside, together they've become worthless. No one does good, not even one. Now in Romans 14, David's obviously talking about the people who are not God's people, right? I mean, the foolish, the people who oppress, and all that. Paul's making a different point in Romans 3, and what is that point? David distinguished between God's people and not God's people. What does Paul say?
He doesn't.
You're all not God's people. We are all not God's people. Why? We've all sinned. We are all subject to what the fool in Romans 14 or Psalm 14 is subject to. We're all in that boat because of sin.
That's all that difference too between you were born in Israel and came to know God versus in the kingdom of Christ, all know Christ before they come to faith.
Yeah, the kingdom of Christ is different for that purpose because nobody's born into that relationship. It's a relationship that's sought after and given, not born into. It's a stunning turn of events, right, between Psalm 14 that at least admits, well, there's some good people and there's some bad people, and then Paul gets to Romans 3 and says, well, guess what? We're all bad people, in the sense that we've all sinned and we're all guilty before God. That causes us all to cry out collectively for the same solution, Jew and Gentile alike. We all need Christ. That's the next part of the letter is, you're all in sin, therefore, you all need Christ.
And that's that meaning of a lot of the Psalms where, you could read it and interpret it one way, you could read it and interpret it the other way.
Yeah. Some would call that like a greater fulfillment. There's an original fulfillment, and then there's something that's even bigger that comes about later.
Establishes the principle of the
It's extended that way. Whoops. I just really like this quote from Kidner. He says, every sin implies the effrontery of supposedly knowing better than God. When you sin, it's ultimately a choice to say, well, I know he said, but, right? And then what happens? That's the nature of the original sin in the garden. What was it? God said, don't eat the tree. And Eve said, at Satan's encouragement, well, I think I better. Right? It'd be good for me. All the other reasons, right? Good for the eyes, good for all the things. And then she convinces Adam to make the same problem.
I had a couple of notes on here.
Oh, dear.
I thought there were some interesting phrases in this poem, and I just started looking them up, saying, okay, where are these at? Where are these workers of iniquity? That idea, and that's one that it appears a lot in the Psalms. I found out, I don't know, probably a dozen references to that. A couple of times in Proverbs and in Luke 13, but that's an interesting phrase, workers of iniquity. And Luke uses that same phrase too.
Yeah, the people who do the wrong things.
Yeah.
This is the description.
Children of men is an interesting phrase that this psalm.
Yeah, children or sons of men, pretty common, I think.
It's, I actually looked it up and said, okay, how many times did I find it? Found it 3 times in other Psalms, once in Ezekiel, once in Daniel, once in Lamentations. So it's used a few times, but it's not super.
Just the plural of sons of men?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's not sons of men, it's children of men, the children of men.
Okay.
The children of men do this.
Okay. Because I know son of man is in Psalm 10, I think.
Paul said in his heart's only used one at a time, and that's the parallel Psalm 50.
Oh, I didn't even mention that. We're totally slam out of time.
Yeah.
I don't know that I have it on here. Anyway, just something to note. If you have good footnotes in your Bible, it will probably say something like a note to Psalm 53. If you read Psalm 53, it is almost word for word exactly Psalm 14. The only difference is verses 5 and 6. There's a change in, and it changes the subject, really. It changes what it's looking at. But 5 and 6 in Psalm 14 are different from their parallel in Psalm 53. But in like 5 years, when we get to Psalm 53, we'll make note of it. Whenever that happens. I wanted to make sure I got these 2 things on here. If Psalm 14 describes a dark world, or be reminded that Jesus sent us as lights into the world. He didn't send us as lights into a well-lit place, right? Like bringing your flashlight to Home Depot and going through the lighting section. That's not what it looks like. It looks like carrying a candle through a dark castle, right? He sent us as lights into a dark place. As the world continues to spiral downward, don't be surprised at what you find. It's going to get bad because it abandons God increasingly. And so increasingly, it's going to get worse and worse and worse. This also informs us maybe when we start evangelistic efforts. I was having a conversation with David this morning at breakfast. With so many people, we can't start with Jesus and the gospel. We have to start with God. Because they may not even believe that God exists, right? Even Paul in Acts 17, he had to start with God, not Jesus. He gets there, but he has to start with what God does. Okay, too much more stuff. Anyway. All right. If I can, I'll mention that next week. Next week, Psalm 15. If you haven't picked up the material yet, it's up here in a pile. Make sure you pick up all of the packet because it has the texts and the questions for the rest of January, and then Lord willing, we'll have the rest of February done soon. All right. Thank you, guys.